Okay, so as promised, moving on to talk about Anselm's ontological argument. There are a variety of versions of this. I'm going to give you the traditional one, and frankly, most of the rest of them up until about 15 years ago were all kind of just restatements of the same thing. So Anselm implores us initially to say, forget God. I don't want to talk about God. Because it's just too confusing, too many conceptions, too many connotations, too many different things involved there. So forget God. Let's just talk about this concept. That than which no greater can be conceived, which I like to call the NGC, the no greater conceivable. There's actually a reason that he didn't say that it was the greatest thing you can think of, although that's sort of along the lines. He doesn't want this notion to be polluted by the limits of our imagination. So we're not going to say that we're talking about the greatest thing I can think of, because that's limited to what I can think of. We're going to say that what we're talking about is at least as good as that. There's no greater conceivable. So just as a thought experiment, forget all the business about God. Just think to yourself, what would something, the thing that I cannot imagine anything better than, what would its properties be? And so sometimes this is referred to as the sum of all perfections. And remember, this is the ontological argument. An ontology, you may recall, is a metaphysical component. Metaphysics asks the question, what is real? Whatever the answer to that is part of the ontology. So it's like a list of all things that are real. That's what an ontology is. So, forget God. We're just going to think that than which no greater can be conceived, or some entity, some thing that is the sum of all perfections. And the way we do this is we just ask ourselves, for any given thing, is it better to have it or to not have it? So, for example, is it better to have knowledge or to have no knowledge? And of course the answer is, it's better to have knowledge. Well, how much knowledge? A little bit of knowledge, a medium amount of knowledge, or a lot of knowledge? Well, of course it would be better to have a lot of knowledge. Well, would it be better to have even more than that? Yeah. Well, would it be better to have even more than that? Yes, and remember what we're working with here is this concept of the greatest conceivable thing, or something that's at least as great as what we can conceive, that than which no greater can be conceived. So if having knowledge is better than not having knowledge, then our thing, our theoretical entity, would have knowledge. How much knowledge? Well, all of it. Because anything short of that, we could say, well, if it knew more, it'd be even better, right? So because we're talking about something we can't think of anything better than, that thing must have knowledge, and it must have all the knowledge, right? Because if it has anything less than all the knowledge, well then, just keep pressing your imagination for something even better, like something with more knowledge. So, an unsurpassable amount of knowledge, this thing, that than which no greater can be conceived, if it existed, would have all the knowledge, because that's what it would be to be sort of perfect on that scale. How about able to do stuff? Is it better to be able to do stuff or to not be able to do stuff? And of course the answer here is obvious. It is better to be able to do stuff. Well, is it better to be able to do a couple of things or a bunch of things? Of course it is better to be able to do a bunch of things. Is it better to be able to do like just a lot of things or all things? And of course, it's better to be able to do all things. So any limit that you place in your imagination, you've got to ask yourself, could I add to it? Could I imagine something even greater? So being able to do stuff is a perfection, and so our theoretical no greater conceivable entity would be able to do stuff. What stuff? Well, any limit you place would mean that you could think of something better, right? Being able to do all the stuff you can imagine, plus whatever stuff you're not imagining, I guess. So the NGC are no greater conceivable. It's great. Can it do stuff? Yes. How much stuff? All the stuff. It's better to be able to do everything than to be able to do something less than everything, right? Okay, what about moral goodness? Is it better to be good or evil? It's better to be good. You just got to take my word for this. Is it better to be kind of good or really good? It's better to be really good. Is it better to be really good or like super duper good? Super duper good. Better to be super duper good or completely good? Clearly, completely good is more desirable. So when it comes to this sum of all perfections, this entity, this concept, would have all the knowledge, would be able to do everything, would be morally perfect. So let me ask you this. Is it better to exist or to not exist? Of course, it's better to exist. So by definition, simply by analyzing this concept that we made up, we know that it must exist because to exist is better than to not exist. So if you're imagining an entity that knows it all, can do it all, and is morally perfect but doesn't exist, you can do better. You can imagine that same being even better, and that's what our definition tells us we have to do, right? That existing is better than non-existing. So by definition of this concept, it must exist. That's not too bad, right? Because what Anselm thinks he's given us here is a knockdown, drag-out argument that guarantees that God has these properties and exists. And that's pretty good. Because remember, up until now, we're like, yeah, but it doesn't prove any of this is true. Yeah, but we don't get any of this stuff out of it. Well, Anselm has given us an argument that does get us to this omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent stuff that we've been hoping we could find in a conception of God. But he takes it further, right? And this is what makes it an ontological argument. When we remember before I said ontological means it's the list of all the things that are real. It's that last step, that it's better to exist than to not exist, that makes existence a entailed, necessary part of the definition of whatever this no greater conceivable thing is. So by definition, has knowledge, all the knowledge. Can do stuff, can do all the stuff. Is morally good, in fact, is morally perfect. And by definition, exists. So he thinks what he's done is simply analyze a concept, and from that, he can guarantee the existence of this thing. Because once again, if you imagine all this stuff but not existing, then you could conceive of something greater. So you're not there yet. You're not at this definition. And so he says, he agrees with, there's a Bible verse that says, the fool hath said in his heart there is no God. And so this is Anselm's explanation in many ways of why that person is a fool. If a person, according to Anselm, understands this argument and still denies that God exists, well then either they have limited imagination, right? Which means they're a fool because they're not as smart as they could be. They're a fool because their imagination doesn't entail existence, even though that's a necessary component of this. Or they understand the argument. They understand that existence is entailed by this no greater conceivable thing, because to exist is better than to not exist, and they still reject it. And that, he says, is a logical contradiction. So, according to Anselm, if you don't believe in God, you're a fool, either because you lack enough imagination to think of this thing, or you've thought of it and you still reject it, even though you know that existence is entailed in its definition. I mean, I like it, you know. I don't know that it does all the work we want it to do, but at least what we have here is something that addresses these points and says there must be such a thing. Objections to this argument? Yes, of course. Kant, as a matter of fact, is responsible for one of the important objections to this, and his argument goes something like this. Play my game with me, right? Imagine a horse. Are you imagining a horse? Is it majestic? So whatever horse you have in mind, take that horse and keep everything the same, but turn it purple. Now you're thinking of the purple horse. Now take that purple horse and double it in size in your mind. You with me so far? Now make it polka dotted. You notice how every time I say, make it purple, make it larger, make it polka dotted, the image in your mind changes a little bit, right? Okay, now take your gigantic purple polka dotted horse in your mind and imagine it existing. Nothing changes. Existence isn't a property that describes something. Or to put it in Kant's words, existence is not rightly predicated of any object. That is, to imagine a horse, even a purple polka dotted gigantic horse, is to imagine it as though it existed. Okay? So existence isn't a property that's added on to a concept. It's sort of implied in the idea of imagining it in the first place. It's sort of like saying, well, if this thing existed, what would its properties be? So existence is not a new property that you can add on to something like you can turning it purple, turning it green, or whatever, making it polka dotted and stuff like that. So Kant's objection is, and you can put this on the exam if you want, that existence is not rightly predicated of objects. It doesn't add anything new to a concept the way saying it has knowledge, saying it's capable, or saying it's moral does. So adding existence isn't like an adjective. It isn't the kind of thing you can add on to expand upon or to clarify a concept. Incidentally, there's another argument, another objection to it, and that objection goes something like this. Oh, that's awesome, Anselm. What if I imagined an island than which no greater can be conceived? What would be the greatest conceivable island? Well, let's see, is it better for an island to have buried treasure on it or no buried treasure? It's definitely better that it has buried treasure. So like a little buried treasure or a lot of buried treasure? A lot. Like a lot or like, a total boatload. Oh yeah, boatload. All the treasure, right? Oh, and since it's better to exist than not exist, then the very notion of the greatest conceivable island must exist. So what are we doing wasting our time watching these videos? We should be out trying to find the island with all the treasure, right? So there's sort of a problem with it. Anselm has an answer to that. He anticipated this objection, and he said that it doesn't really work for the greatest conceivable blank, right? It's not, you can't have the greatest conceivable teacher, the greatest conceivable desk, the greatest conceivable car, okay? It's just the greatest conceivable period. That than which no greater can be conceived. We didn't say the greatest conceivable monkey or the greatest conceivable bicycle or whatever, just that than which no greater can be conceived. And so that argument isn't going to work for the greatest conceivable island, Anselm tells us, just the greatest conceivable period. So in other words, some people object on this level too. They say, so this argument literally works for one and only one thing. Anselm didn't have a problem with that. He says, yes, that's exactly how it works. So our two objections so far are, this doesn't work for the greatest conceivable blank, or Kant's famous objection that existence is not rightly predicated of an object. And we did our little thought experiment hoping to show that when you added existence to your concept of the horse, nothing about your concept or your image of that horse changed, whereas it did when you added these other properties. And so existence being not rightly predicated of an object, the ontological argument fails because it's that last premise, that last step that does all the work, right? Greater to exist than not exist, therefore this thing must exist. Kant says, sorry, you can do everything else, but you got to stop at existence because it's not a predicate. It's not something that adds to a concept. All right, last but not least, the problem of evil. I don't think this is a particularly difficult idea. I think this is the same argument that you've probably run into, either you've made or other people have made to you throughout your life. And that is, among these four statements, they cannot all be true. God knows evil exists because God's omniscient and God knows everything. God can prevent it because God can do everything. God wants to prevent evil because morally perfect beings want to stop evil. I mean, you know, if you know that evil is happening and you don't even want to stop it, then you're probably not a morally perfect person. You're probably kind of a scumbag, no offense. God knows evil exists. God can prevent evil. God wants to prevent evil. And yet, there is evil. Can't have all four, right? Because if you know something exists and you want to prevent it and you're able to prevent it, well, then you prevent it. And if you don't prevent it, well, then it's either because you didn't know what was going on, you were powerless to stop it, or you didn't want to stop it, right? That's the standard we hold you to. If you know that the kid next door is getting abused, if you know it, and you could stop it, and you don't, well, then I guess you didn't want to. Maybe you have good reasons for not wanting to. Maybe the kid's a real jerk. I'm sorry, that's terrible. The point is that we hold moral beings accountable. Now, if you don't know that evil is going on, we don't blame you. But God does know. God knows it all. If you're powerless to stop it, we don't blame you. But that doesn't work for God. We're not going to say God's powerless to do anything about it. If you don't want to stop it, we might actually blame you, right? You might say, why wouldn't you want to stop that? But, so which of these has to go, or is it this one that has to go? Maybe there really is no evil. And a lot of people want to take this road, and I don't blame you. Right? Evil is just a matter of opinion or a matter of perspective. I consider it evil when you do something horrible to me, but maybe you find it hilarious and you think it's a great thing. I don't know what we want to say about that. But it's a little difficult to say that evil doesn't exist. However, if we say that evil is a judgment call and so it doesn't exist on its own, we're kind of skeptical on that front, that's fine. This argument can be made if you want to replace the word evil with the word suffering. God knows that things suffer, because things do suffer. We might argue about whether or not there's such a thing as evil, but we cannot argue that there's no such thing as suffering. That we know. There is such a thing as suffering. Suffering exists. God could stop suffering. God knows there's suffering. God could stop it, and God wants to stop it. And yet it continues to exist. So what do? The answer is something has to go. And I know a lot of people don't want to get rid of them, but there's really no way to hold all four at the same time. We could say God just doesn't know about suffering or evil. You know, the Thomas Jefferson deist conception. Look, he kicked the ball, got it rolling, he sheeted them, but then kind of took off and really didn't pay attention. Or, look, God can't prevent suffering. No one can prevent it. It's just how things are. Or God doesn't want to prevent suffering. And we can make any of these cases. And in fact, what people will say is something like, look, sometimes you have to suffer to get at a greater good. And that's okay, but that's kind of a weaselly way of getting around this. Because I think in that case, we can say that it's not really suffering. I know that that may not be a clear argument, but if like working out is suffering because there's pain. But you do the pain for the benefit. So if there is a net benefit in the end, then we just kind of say, well, you know, I had minus 10 suffering points, but I had plus 20 in benefit points, so it's a net gain, it's a plus 10. Or we might say, look, evil exists because people do evil. People allow evil to exist. Okay, well, why didn't God step in and stop us? And the argument there is something like, it is more evil to enslave everybody. It is more evil to take away free will than to put up with the evil that happens as a result of free will. Does that make any sense? That, yeah, I know that if I let people act freely, they're going to do some bad stuff. They're going to hurt some other people. There's going to be some suffering. There may even be some evil. But it would be worse for me to imprison them and prevent them from having free will. And so, in the end, free will, which is good, has a necessary consequence that some evil will happen. But it is worse to prevent people from exercising their free will. I will say for my own part, some people don't want to agree with me, but I think I'm right about this. If that's the line you want to take, then that is the same as denying that evil exists. If you're faced with a situation where you're going to have a bad outcome either way, but you choose the one with the least bad outcome, I guess you can still say it's bad, but in comparison, it's good, because it was less bad than the alternative. Same thing here. If our two alternatives are enslave everybody or put up with some of the evil that they do by letting them be free, then when we let them be free, that is denying that evil exists, because it would be worse, right? It would be more evil to prevent them from doing this. Does that make sense? So, it's kind of a best situation under bad circumstances case there. A little weird, because we end up saying something along the lines of, this is a perfect world. It could not be better than it is, right? And I don't know that we want to go down that road, because we look around us and everywhere we see suffering and evil, and we say, well, gee, it could be better if we didn't have so much suffering and evil. So one argument is, well, actually not really. This is a necessary and natural consequence of people being free to choose on their own, that sometimes you're going to have some evil and some suffering. So this is the argument against God's existence, the idea that this conception of a God is incompatible with this idea that there is evil or there is suffering in the world, because an all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect being would step in and do something about it. So that's the idea behind the problem of evil, that there is no God, or if there is, it doesn't have all those properties. And that's how the problem of evil works.